Ethan's chest burned as he trudged through the knee-deep snow, the biting cold seeping into his bones. His body ached, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but it was the look in Koda's eyes that kept him moving. The hybrid wolf dog, once abandoned and left to fend for himself, had become Ethan's only lifeline in these unforgiving mountains. Despite the storm's fury, Koda walked ahead with unwavering strength, his thick fur matted with snow, ears pricked and alert for any sign of danger. The wind howled like a beast, icy gusts cutting through the air, stealing Ethan's breath. But it was more than the storm he feared. The wilderness, wild and unforgiving, was crawling with danger. Koda had already saved him more than once, fighting off wolves, bears and predators far fiercer than the cold. Still, every step forward felt like they were slipping closer to the edge of survival. And then the growl pierced the air, a low, menacing sound that made the hairs on Ethan's neck stand up. Koda froze instantly, his head tilting slightly as his nose twitched. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, the panic rising like a tide. He knew that sound. Wolves. Before Ethan could react, Koda shifted in front of him, his body a solid wall of protection. There was no escaping the pack now, not in the blinding snowstorm, not with Koda injured and on edge. The wolf dog bared his teeth, growling in a way that Ethan had never heard before. It wasn't just a warning, it was a vow. A promise to fight, to protect, no matter the cost. And in that moment, with the wolves closing in from every direction, Ethan knew that the only way out of this nightmare was through the fierce loyalty and strength of the creature he had once abandoned. Koda wasn't just a dog. He was his only chance at survival. Ethan felt the weight of the world pressing down on him as he stumbled through the thick snow, barely able to keep his balance. The storm raged around them, a savage force that seemed determined to swallow everything whole. His hands were numb, his face frozen, but there was one thing that kept him going: Koda. The wolf dog, though injured, never faltered. Koda's amber eyes flicked back at Ethan with unwavering resolve, his body moving with a grace and strength that Ethan couldn't help but admire. Once, Koda had been abandoned, left alone to fend for himself in the wild, just like Ethan had once felt. They had both been discarded by the world, left to face the cold and the cruel wilderness on their own. But Koda had found him, tracking him down after weeks of searching, and in doing so, had saved Ethan's life. It wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a bond that went beyond anything Ethan had ever known. Koda wasn't just a dog. He was something more, something wild, something loyal beyond comprehension. "Come on, buddy," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold. He could barely hear his own words over the storm's roar, but Koda heard him. The wolf dog stopped and turned, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the snowstorm ahead. He whined softly, then began to move again, pushing forward with determination. Ethan followed, though every step felt heavier than the last. The wind whipped his face, turning his skin raw. His clothes, once thick and warm, had long since stopped protecting him from the freezing cold. Despite the biting wind and endless snow, Ethan couldn't bring himself to stop. He couldn't afford to. Not with Koda by his side. He had to keep moving, had to keep going for both of them. He owed it to Koda to never stop fighting. They had come this far after all. The journey had started weeks ago when they were caught off guard by the sudden storm. The mountains had been treacherous, the weather unforgiving, but Koda had never hesitated. The wolf dog had always been Ethan's guide, his protector. When they had gotten separated from their group during the hike, it was Koda who had tracked him down, guiding him through the snow, finding food when Ethan couldn't. It was Koda who kept him alive, even when the chances of survival seemed slimmer with each passing day. But now things were different. The snow was deeper, the cold sharper, and Koda's leg was still injured from an earlier encounter with a wild animal. Ethan could see the limp in the wolf dog's step, the subtle way Koda was shifting his weight to protect the injured leg. But Koda never slowed down, never gave up. His loyalty was unwavering. It was as if the wolf dog had made a silent promise to Ethan to never leave him behind, no matter the cost. "Thank you," Ethan muttered, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop them. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Koda didn't respond with words, but he didn't need to. Instead, the wolf dog paused, glanced back at Ethan, and let out a soft, reassuring growl. It was enough. Ethan could feel the bond between them, that unspoken understanding. Koda didn't need to say anything. He was here. He was with him. And that was all that mattered. The storm continued to rage around them, but Ethan could feel a flicker of hope deep within him. They weren't alone. Not anymore. But the snow was falling harder now, faster. Ethan's vision blurred as he squinted through the whiteout, struggling to see where they were headed. The storm had swallowed the world whole, and the familiar mountain paths had disappeared beneath the thick blanket of snow. It was impossible to know which way to go. Koda stopped again, this time his head held high, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. His ears flicked, and then his body tensed, muscles coiling as if he was preparing for something. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Koda didn't answer, but he didn't need to. In a flash, he darted to the side, his body a blur of motion as he disappeared into the snow. "Wait!" Ethan cried out, panic rising in his chest. But it was too late. Koda was already gone, swallowed by the storm. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before following, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what Koda had sensed, but he trusted the wolf dog with his life. He stumbled forward, pushing through the snow, calling out for Koda. His voice was lost in the wind, but he kept shouting anyway, desperation in his voice. "Koda," he cried again. "Where are you?" And then through the blizzard's howl Ethan heard it, Koda's growl low and threatening. Ethan's heart stopped. The wolves were here. Before he could react, Koda burst from the storm, his golden-brown fur flashing against the white snow. His body was poised, ready to fight, his amber eyes blazing with defiance. The wolfdog's protective stance told Ethan everything he needed to know. The pack was closing in. The wolves emerged from the storm, their eyes glowing like fiery embers in the dark, their bodies sleek and fast, moving with predatory grace. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them circle, the pack closing in, surrounding them from all sides. The wind carried their growls to him, deep, guttural sounds that reverberated through the cold air. Ethan instinctively took a step back, his breath shallow and quick, but Koda stood firm, unwavering in his stance. The wolfdog's body was a mountain of muscle and strength, but there was an air of something even deeper in his posture, something primal. His golden-brown fur was matted with snow, but his eyes never left the advancing wolves, and his growl rumbled deep in his chest, sending a message, "Not today." Ethan's hand tightened around the ice axe, but his mind was racing. They were outnumbered, and the wolves weren't just predators, they were desperate. Hungry. And the storm had made the world a maze with no way out. There was nowhere to run. "Stay close to me, Koda," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. The wolf dog glanced back at him for a brief moment, his amber eyes steady and calm, and then he lunged. The first wolf, a lean gray creature, tried to snap at Koda, but the wolf dog was too quick. With a growl that shook the air, Koda collided with the wolf, sending it tumbling through the snow. The second wolf came at him from the side, teeth bared, but Koda was ready. He spun, dodging the attack with effortless agility, and lashed out with his powerful paws, knocking the wolf back. Ethan could hear the sharp, sickening sound of the impact, but Koda didn't stop. He was a force of nature, relentless, determined, and full of protective fury. Ethan watched, his heart in his throat, as Koda fought. He had never seen a creature move with such speed and strength before, but it wasn't just physical power that made Koda special, it was the bond they shared. Ethan could feel it in his chest, the way Koda fought not just to survive but to protect him. The wolf dog wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting Ethan too. A third wolf appeared from the blizzard, coming at Ethan with a snarl. Koda saw it immediately, reacting faster than Ethan could process. With a powerful lunge, Koda intercepted the wolf midair, his jaws snapping shut just inches from its throat. The two animals collided with a crash, rolling in the snow, kicking up flurries of white powder. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he watched Koda and the wolves tumble and fight. But even as the battle raged, Ethan could feel the creeping weight of desperation settling in. How long could Koda hold them off? The storm was worsening, the cold gnawing at his bones, and Koda, though fierce and strong, was clearly tiring. His movements, once sharp and fluid, were slowing. One of the wolves broke off from the fight, darting around Koda to get a better angle. Ethan knew what was happening. The pack was working together, using their numbers to wear Koda down. They were playing the long game, and Koda's strength was fading. "Koda!" Ethan shouted, panic gripping him. The wolfdog's head snapped toward him, eyes filled with warning. But before he could react, the largest of the wolves, its fur dark as midnight, lunged at Koda's exposed side. The impact sent Koda stumbling sideways, crashing into the snow with a yelp. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "No!" he screamed. He started toward Koda, but his legs felt like lead, his mind clouded with fear. He couldn't reach him in time. The wolf dog was on the ground, struggling beneath the weight of the pack. The wolves were closing in. This was it. This was the moment Ethan had feared. The moment Koda might not be able to protect him anymore. But then something changed. Koda's growl grew louder, more ferocious, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. And then, with a sudden burst of strength, Koda twisted beneath the wolf that had him pinned. His jaws snapped down, catching the dark wolf by the scruff of its neck, and with a brutal force he threw it aside, sending it tumbling through the snow. Koda rose to his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion, but there was no surrender in his eyes. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. Ethan watched in awe as Koda, his golden-brown fur slick with blood and snow, stood tall in the face of the pack. The wolves hesitated for a moment, sensing the shift in power. They had underestimated the Wolfdog'S will to survive. Koda wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for Ethan's too. The largest wolf, its eyes cold and calculating, circled Koda, testing for weakness. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the battle. Koda wasn't giving up. Not while Ethan was here. And Ethan wouldn't leave him. He couldn't. The pack growled in unison, their voices rising to a fever pitch as they prepared to make their final move. The wolves closed in, the pack moving as one. Their eyes glowed with hunger and malice, their breath coming in ragged bursts of fog in the icy air. Koda stood firm, his muscles taut and ready, but Ethan could see the toll the battle had taken on him. Blood stained his fur and his movements were slower, less fluid. The fight was wearing him down and the pack could sense it. Ethan's mind raced. He had to do something. He couldn't let Koda fight alone. But what could he do? His hands were numb, his body shaking from the cold, and every step felt like it might be his last. But he knew one thing for sure. If Koda fell, they were both dead. The wolves were preparing for the final attack. The largest one, the alpha, snarled low, its hackles raised as it crouched into position. It was no longer a question of if they would win, but when. Koda's eyes met Ethan's for just a second, fierce, determined, and full of something Ethan couldn't fully understand. But in that moment he realized the truth. Koda had always been fighting not just for survival but for him. They were bound together by something deeper than loyalty. It was a bond forged in fire, in abandonment, and in the shared struggle to survive. Koda had saved him time and time again, and now Ethan had to save him. With everything in him, Ethan pulled free the hunting knife from his pack and rushed forward, the cold biting into his skin as he ran, every muscle screaming for him to stop. He didn't care. He couldn't care. He had to help Koda. Get away from him. Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. The wolves barely acknowledged his presence. They had their sights set on Koda, and Ethan was just another obstacle in their way. But he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. As he neared the alpha wolf, its teeth bared and eyes flashing with deadly intent, Koda leaped forward, his jaws snapping. The force of Koda's body slamming into the alpha sent it stumbling back, momentarily off balance. The smaller wolves hesitated, unsure whether to attack Ethan or continue with Koda. It was a moment of precious uncertainty. Ethan seized it. He dove forward, blade raised, and thrust it toward the nearest wolf. The wolf snarled, leaping to the side just in time to avoid the strike, but Ethan didn't hesitate. He swung again, this time catching the wolf's side. It howled in pain but didn't retreat. The wolves didn't care about pain. They only cared about domination. Koda, seeing Ethan's move, immediately reacted, lunging at the alpha once more. His jaws locked around the alpha's throat, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears as the two beasts fought in a blur of claws, teeth, and snow. The sounds of the struggle were deafening, growls, snarls, the tearing of flesh. But Koda wasn't going to give up. His body was bloodied, his fur matted with the remnants of the battle, but he fought with the strength of an unstoppable force. Ethan could see it in the way he fought. This wasn't just survival. This was his promise to Ethan. To protect. The alpha wolf tried to twist free, but Koda's grip was unyielding. With a final desperate growl, Koda dragged the alpha to the ground, sinking his teeth deeper into its throat, until the struggling stopped and the pack fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. The wind howled around them, but the wolves, stunned and intimidated by Koda's dominance, began to retreat. The pack scattered into the storm, disappearing into the blizzard as quickly as they had arrived. Ethan stood frozen in place, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His eyes moved from the retreating pack to Koda, who was now standing over the fallen alpha, panting heavily, blood dripping from his fur. The Wolfdog'S amber eyes met his, weary but triumphant. Koda had done it. He had protected them both. Ethan's legs finally gave out beneath him and he collapsed to the ground, the adrenaline of the moment fading. His body screamed with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. Not yet. They had survived, barely, but there was still so much more to face. Koda limped over to him, his side heaving, but he nudged Ethan gently, his head resting against his shoulder as if to reassure him that everything would be okay. Ethan wrapped an arm around Koda, pulling him close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to let go. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. "We're not out of this yet, buddy," Ethan said, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "But we're getting there." Koda nuzzled him again, his eyes softening. The storm was still raging around them, but for a brief moment there was peace. But it wouldn't last long. The battle was over, but the fight for survival was far from finished. The cold was creeping in again, stronger this time. They still had to find shelter. And more dangers were out there, hidden in the storm, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ethan's thoughts raced as he surveyed their surroundings. The world was an endless expanse of white, the landscape unrecognizable under the thick snow. They couldn't stay here. They needed to move. But where? Koda raised his head, sniffing the air, his body tense once more. The wolfdog had always known the way even in the storm. Ethan trusted him. He had no choice. "Lead the way," Ethan murmured. And with that, Koda moved ahead, his body low to the ground, eyes scanning the horizon, prepared for whatever was to come next. The storm raged with a ferocity that seemed to grow by the minute, the wind howling and biting at Ethan's exposed skin. The snow beneath his boots was thick and treacherous, each step feeling like it might be his last. But through it all, Koda moved with purpose, his strong legs cutting through the snow with ease, as though he had a sixth sense for where they needed to go. Ethan was struggling to keep up, his body exhausted from the battle with the wolves and the relentless cold that seemed to seep into his bones. His breath came out in white clouds, his hands numb despite the gloves. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Koda was leading the way. For hours they trekked through the mountains, the wind biting at them from all sides. The landscape around them had become a blur, endless snow and jagged peaks stretching into the sky, with no sign of life, no sign of shelter. Ethan's mind was foggy, his thoughts clouded with exhaustion, but he never once considered turning back. He couldn't. Koda was still with him, still guiding him forward, and that was enough. It wasn't until the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the world in an eerie twilight, that they finally stumbled upon a break in the mountainside, a narrow cave tucked between two towering rock formations. Koda stopped in front of it, his ears perked, and looked back at Ethan, his amber eyes filled with what could only be described as a silent plea. Ethan didn't need any more convincing. He stumbled toward the cave, his legs aching, his body feeling like it was on the brink of collapse. The moment he stepped inside, the cold lessened just enough for him to draw in a full breath. The cave was small but dry, with just enough room for both of them to find some semblance of shelter. Koda followed him inside, his fur matted with snow and blood, and lay down near the entrance, his body curled protectively. Ethan sank to the ground beside him, his hands shaking as he removed his pack and rifled through it for whatever he could find to eat. His mind was barely functioning and his body was screaming for rest, but he forced himself to stay awake. They couldn't afford to sleep just yet. The wolves were still out there. He took out the last of their emergency rations, a small packet of freeze-dried food, and slowly began to eat, though he could barely taste it. His mind kept drifting back to the battle. To the moment when Koda had been overwhelmed by the pack. To the look in the Wolfdog's eyes when they had fought side by side. It was as if Koda had never doubted that they would survive. Ethan wasn't sure he could say the same for himself. But then Koda nudged him, his wet nose pressing against Ethan's arm, and for a moment, everything seemed to fade away. The cold, the exhaustion, the fear, everything. It was just him and Koda, the two of them against the world. "We're gonna make it," Ethan whispered hoarsely, not sure if he was trying to convince Koda or himself. "We have to." Koda gave a soft whine, his amber eyes never leaving Ethan's face, as if he understood every word. And in that moment, Ethan knew that they weren't alone in this fight. They had each other, and that meant everything. The night settled in around them, the storm still howling outside, but inside the cave there was a strange sense of calm. Koda's steady presence beside him gave Ethan a sense of safety, of purpose. But as the hours passed, the reality of their situation began to sink in again. They were still deep in the mountains, still stranded in a dangerous, frozen wilderness. The wolves hadn't given up. And tomorrow they would have to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan lay down beside Koda, his body finally succumbing to the weight of exhaustion, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced with fear and uncertainty. Would they make it out of this alive? Could Koda keep protecting him like this? Was their bond strong enough to survive whatever came next? The questions gnawed at him, but as he drifted into a fitful sleep, Koda's presence beside him grounded him. The Wolfdog's rhythmic breathing was a constant reminder that they weren't alone, that together they could face anything. Hours passed in a blur, and when Ethan awoke, the cave was shrouded in darkness. The storm had subsided, but the cold had only deepened. He sat up slowly, wincing as his body protested, and found Koda still curled up beside him, his fur now stiff with frost. Ethan rubbed his eyes and looked around the cave. It was then he noticed the faintest flicker of light outside, the break of dawn. The storm was clearing, and the world beyond the cave was slowly being revealed once more. The mountains were still vast, their peaks towering and jagged against the pale light of the morning sky. But for the first time since they had been trapped in this unforgiving place, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Koda stirred beside him, sensing the change, and got to his feet, shaking the snow from his fur. His amber eyes locked with Ethan's, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Like there was no storm, no wolves, no danger, just the two of them. Ethan stood as well, his legs unsteady, but he didn't hesitate. He gathered what little gear they had left and nodded toward Koda. "Let's go," he said, determination in his voice. "We're getting out of here." Koda gave a soft bark as if in agreement, and turned toward the mouth of the cave. They weren't done yet. There was still a long road ahead, but together they would make it. The air outside the cave was bitter, the wind sharp against Ethan's skin as he stepped out into the harsh light of the morning. The storm had passed, but the mountains were still cold and unforgiving, the snow thick beneath his boots. Koda was already ahead, leading the way with a purposeful stride, his body braced against the biting cold, his fur still stiff from the night's chill. Ethan followed closely, trying to keep up with the Wolfdog's steady pace, but his limbs felt like lead. Every movement was a struggle, each breath a labor. Koda didn't stop though. He couldn't. The wilderness around them was still hostile, silent but dangerous. The wolves were still out there, and there were other threats too. Ethan knew they couldn't afford to linger. They had to keep moving even if it meant pushing their limits. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, jagged and unforgiving. The world was a vast, empty wilderness, and they were just two specks in it, fighting for survival. Hours passed in a blur, with no sign of civilization, no sign of rescue. The landscape was as desolate as ever, and Ethan's exhaustion grew by the minute. His body ached, his stomach growled with hunger, and his thoughts were starting to feel foggy. But every time he looked at Koda, the Wolfdog's amber eyes shone with determination. There was no quitting. Not for Koda. And not for him. At one point, Ethan collapsed against a snowbank, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building up for days. His head spun, his vision blurred, but Koda was there, nudging him gently with his nose, urging him to keep moving. Okay, Ethan muttered, forcing himself to sit up. He had to keep going. Koda wouldn't leave him behind. The Wolfdog's persistence pushed him forward, each step a battle, but they kept moving, one foot in front of the other. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow-covered mountains, and Ethan knew they couldn't afford to be out here after dark. They had to find shelter, fast. And then, just as hope seemed to be fading, they saw it. A small cabin, tucked away in a hollow between two mountains, partially hidden by the trees. Ethan blinked, hardly believing his eyes. It was old, weathered, but it was a shelter. A safe place. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could almost taste relief. Koda barked once, a sharp, urgent sound, and Ethan's heart lifted. Is it real? Ethan whispered to himself, his legs nearly giving way as he stumbled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sight of the cabin was like a lifeline, and he clung to it with every ounce of strength he had left. They reached the cabin, and Koda stood guard at the entrance, his ears perked, eyes scanning the area for any threats. Ethan took a deep breath, his body finally giving in to the weight of exhaustion, but he knew they couldn't stop yet. Not until they were inside. With shaking hands he pushed open the creaky door, and it groaned in protest. The interior was dark, dusty, and abandoned, but it was warm enough to offer them refuge. Koda slipped inside first, and Ethan followed, closing the door behind him with a sigh of relief. He leaned against the wall, his breath heavy and labored. They were safe, at least for now. Koda padded over to a corner, curling up on the floor, his body still tense, his eyes watching Ethan with a quiet, unspoken understanding. Ethan sank to the floor beside him, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had made it. He pulled out the last of their supplies and began to prepare what little food they had left. His hands were stiff, but he worked quickly, knowing they needed to eat to replenish whatever energy they had left. Koda watched him quietly, his amber eyes softening. It was a simple moment, but it was enough. They had survived. Ethan ate in silence, the cold hunger gnawing at him, but he knew they would make it through this. They had to. He had promised Koda they would. As the evening wore on, the cabin grew quieter, the wind outside howling against the walls, but they were safe. The wolves were far behind them now, and the world outside felt less threatening, though the dangers were never truly gone. Koda curled up next to Ethan, resting his head on his lap, and for the first time in days Ethan allowed himself to relax. The weight of the world seemed to ease just for a moment. "We're gonna get through this," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking slightly as he stroked Koda's thick fur. The wolfdog's eyes closed and he let out a contented sigh, his body relaxing into Ethan's touch. Ethan smiled through the exhaustion, a tear slipping down his cheek without him even realizing it. He wasn't alone anymore. Koda had been with him from the start, had fought by his side, and now they had made it. Together. The storm outside raged on, but in that cabin, surrounded by the mountains, they were safe. They had made it. And no matter what came next, Ethan knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and reflection. Inside the cabin, with the storm having passed and the harshness of the wilderness temporarily softened, Ethan and Koda found the space to heal. The storm had not only battered their bodies but also their spirits, but now, with shelter and warmth, they had the time to regroup. Koda's deep amber eyes never left Ethan's face as they spent their days together in the cabin. The wolf dog was ever watchful, but there was something softer in his gaze now, as if the ordeal had bonded them even more deeply than before. It wasn't just loyalty that passed between them, it was a shared understanding of survival, of what it meant to rely on each other when all seemed lost. Ethan's body was sore, each movement a reminder of the hardships they had faced. The scratches from the wolves were healing, but the bruises and cuts from the endless trek were still raw. His clothes, torn and tattered, were no match for the elements, but he had no choice but to wear them until they could find a way out of this mountain trap. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, there was a peace that settled over him in those quiet moments with Koda. They shared a simple bond now, one built not just on survival but on mutual respect. Koda, who had once been abandoned, had found his purpose. And in turn, Ethan had found his way out of the darkest place he'd ever been. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountain peaks, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered landscape outside, Ethan sat by the cabin window, looking out at the endless white expanse. His fingers gently stroked the collar around Koda's neck, worn and frayed from the journey but still intact. "You're more than just a survivor, Koda," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been my protector. My guide." Koda's ears perked up at the sound of Ethan's voice, and he nudged the man's hand with his nose, offering a soft growl that almost sounded like a purr. It was as if the wolf dog understood not just the words, but the depth of the gratitude that flowed from Ethan's heart. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe deeply. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the journey lift. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. The road ahead was still uncertain. Ethan knew that. He knew the mountains weren't done with them yet. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that they would find their way out of the wilderness, back to civilization, and back to a life where the dangers of the wild were no longer their constant companions. Koda, ever watchful, lay down beside Ethan, his body forming a protective circle. Ethan placed a hand on the wolfdog's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath. There was a strength in Koda that went beyond just muscle. It was a quiet, unwavering force of nature. And Ethan realized, with a pang in his chest, that the bond they had formed in the mountains had become something far greater than either of them had expected. "We've both come a long way, haven't we?" Ethan said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "From being lost, to finding something worth fighting for." Koda responded with a low, contented growl, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floor. It was as if the wolf dog understood the weight of Ethan's words, understood that this journey had not just been about survival. It had been about finding meaning, about rediscovering purpose in a world that had tried to break them. The night grew colder, the wind howling once more as the temperature dropped, but inside the cabin, the warmth of their bond filled the space. Ethan felt his eyelids growing heavy, but he didn't fight it. He was safe here with Koda by his side. and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to rest. He closed his eyes, and as sleep took over, he knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Because they weren't just survivors anymore. They were family. And that was enough. If you were moved by Koda and Ethan's journey, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. It's stories like this that remind us of the power of loyalty and the incredible bonds we share with the creatures we trust. Let us know in the comments, what do you think Koda's greatest strength was? And what would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? Don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories like this, because together we can make the world a little brighter, one story at a time.